Hello? Testing. Okay. Well, good morning, and I wanted to thank Governor Grantham for waking us up this morning and provoking us, and hopefully we can get a lively discussion here. Listening to the governor's discussion really made me, I've been on the private sector for a number of years, and each point she was making about government policy or job, my mind was thinking about the financial aspects of it and how you create markets and finance. So we're going to talk this morning about the interaction between government policy, finance, and markets. We have a very distinguished panel here to speak about it, both with public experience. We have Ted Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt IV, next to me. He runs the Clean Tech Investment Program and is a managing director at Barclays Bank. So had a whole career of experience in financing and banking projects related to renewable energy and other areas. Next to him, we have Adele Morris, who is the policy director for the Climate and Energy Economics program at Brookings Institution, and she looks at the interaction between private markets and public policy. And then we have Naoko Ishii, who is the CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility here today, and she obviously looks very much at the global implications of all of the issues we're talking about. I just wanted to say to Naoko that we started Global Environment Fund, a private sector facility, in 1990. And when the GEF at the World Bank started, we had a lot of trademark issues between our lawyers, and I've heard some of the background discussions that went on at your board about how to get us to stop using the name. The other funny thing was that a number of years ago, a large delegation from Senegal arrived in our offices in Washington, D.C., and they sat in our room, and I had no idea why they were there, but they're in the conference room, so we scrambled and we put up their PowerPoint. And when they said they needed $600 million for their energy program and to support, and it was the energy minister and a number of other ministers from the president's cabinet, we realized they were in the wrong place, and they were supposed to be looking for you. I wanted to take notice of Steve Hubble, Professor Stephen Hubble, who was the founder of what was at the time in 1987 called the Committee for National Institutes of the Environment. That's the origins of this body, this group here, and this conference. And shortly after that, a few years after that, Steve recruited me to the original board, or advisory committee, I guess it was, about the time that we started Global Environment Fund in 1990. And while the Committee for National Institutes of Environment was designed to stimulate some kind of a coalition that would, at the governmental level, put science at the top of decision making in relation to the environment, and in many ways, we in this group and the number of people attending embody the success of that. When we started Global Environment Fund, I thought it was a private sector institution to invest in companies and technologies and products that would bring clean energy to the world. We saw, I thought naively, I'd never been in finance, Ted, before, and I thought that we would be financing the company that would replace the incandescent light bulb and replace the internal combustion engine and end the use of fossil fuels for energy production, electricity production. Boy, that would have been terrific. If we could have done that in our first investments, we wouldn't have a global climate change challenge right now. But what I realized was with $5 million to invest, if we invested it in those dream-like companies, we would lose the money. Even though I was committed as Steve and all the members of all of you as scientists to seeing these things through, I couldn't invest in them. And that really distressed me. How was I going to invest this money? And then I began to realize, wait a minute, this is a 50-year or 100-year transition we're going through. That means if we're smart investors, we have 50 years in front of us, the rest of my adult lifetime, to invest in things incrementally. And that's the fundamental lesson that I took at the beginning of Global Environment Fund, was we needed to invest in a gradual change. And if you look back, from 1990 to today, we've made enormous progress. We are always complaining. We're always concerned governments aren't doing enough and so on. But look at, we've got so much of the transportation system today. We use far less. We've destroyed so much demand for fossil fuel petroleum in recent years because of hybrids, because of higher gasoline mileage on our vehicles. If you look at the amount of renewable energy today as opposed to 1990, all of these things. So in many respects, I'm not sure I've invested wisely along that transition, but there has been an enormous transition of technologies. And we hope that this transition accelerates, and we hope the governor's program and those kinds of things can bring us all there. So we're going to talk about some of these issues today. We're going to talk about subsidies and electricity production, and we're going to talk about the global issues and so on. I wanted to just raise one issue before we turn to our panel that's on my mind as a person who's worried about it being a global citizen. We are going through an enormous transition in the United States. Natural gas has displaced a large amount of coal-fired production in our power plants. We've reduced carbon emissions enormously in the electricity system because of that. The natural gas has enabled, boom has enabled in many respects more renewable energy on the grid. So it's a very positive, in my opinion, transition we're going through. But we can't just hide our eyes to the fact that in some ways in the next few years, the United States is going to become like Norway, the Norway of energy production. Norway says we're green, we have all renewable energy, we have so much wind power, and then they export all that petroleum from the North Sea, carbon count when they go to Kyoto or they go to any international negotiations. So a couple of years ago, my wife, myself, and my adult kids were in West Virginia, and we went over the bridge over the New River, and we looked down, and there were, as my wife counted, 1,200 coal cars in the time it took us to cross this bridge. There's a walkway, you can do a special walk. 1,200 coal cars. So you talk to the local people in West Virginia, and they go, that coal ain't staying here. It's all going to Norfolk, and it's going right out to India and right out to wherever else is buying our coal. We can't hide our eyes from that. We are reducing our own carbon emissions from our energy, but in the global sense, that coal is going to be exported in any rate. So again, as we think about finance markets and the U.S. and hopefully, Naoko, you can talk about some of this, we have to think about the global matters as well. I'd like to talk about a conversation here and go through several different topics, but I thought maybe we could start where the governor kind of left off, which is the relationship between public capital and private markets and how governments, which areas governments can be most useful in which areas of this financial markets they should sort of stay out of. I was in California yesterday meeting with the CalSTART, which is the clean transportation sector, and they were all marveling at Governor Jerry Brown having jumped out again and made the commitment recently that 50% of energy in California will be clean energy by, I think it's 2030, he said, but he doubled the standard overnight. So there are clearly things that governments can do, but what are the things that you think, Adele, from your work, that you can see areas where there are positive policy initiatives to take and where maybe in other areas the broad market should be left alone?
Thanks, Jeff. And I want to thank the organizers of this conference for the excellent discussion and for all of you coming to this discussion. When a lot of people think about finance, they think about project finance. Maybe it's loan guarantees or tax credits for renewable energy or energy efficient appliances and that kind of thing, those sorts of market nudges. And let's just take the United States for a minute. You look across federal programs of this nature, you might see a few billion here, a few billion there, maybe adding up to a few tens of billions of dollars, depending on how you measure it, of programmatic influence in these markets. But to me, that's like talking about the popsicle on top of the iceberg of the private sector economy. We have $2.8 trillion a year in direct private investment, $10.5 trillion a year in private consumption. We have a $17+ trillion a year U.S. economy. And if you really want to do something about greenhouse gas emissions and genuinely protect the climate, you have to be serious about policies that affect the bulk of that economy and gradually steer that iceberg into a lower carbon future. And so, you know, I know that those programs can be catalyzing, they can have important spillovers and develop technology, but unless you're talking about pricing carbon economy-wide, you are simply not serious about climate change. It's really that fundamental. So how do you do it in the most economically responsible way? Because the last thing we want to do is mess up the economic welfare while we're trying to do something about the environment. So the way to do it is very clear. You need those market signals to harness the invisible hand of the economy that's environmentally superior. The simplest way to do this by far is a carbon tax, an excise tax on the carbon content of fossil fuels and other carefully selected greenhouse gas emissions. It's extremely administrable. The U.S. Treasury already collects excise taxes on most of the coal production in the United States. We can totally do this. And use that revenue wisely to offset the macroeconomic burdens that are imposed when you price carbon. And you can do that by reducing other taxes, by ensuring that low-income households are not worse off. Nobody wants to hurt low-income households with our environmental protection policies. And use an economically efficient set of market signals and predictable trends in what it's going to cost you to emit carbon to shift that capital stock in a more emissions efficient way. You do it gradually, you do it predictably. Investment takes over both in terms of emissions abating technologies and the development of new technologies. You get all those incentives right, and then you harness that profit motive for the betterment of the planet. I mean, anything short of that, you're just kind of tinkering at the edges, I would say. And there are very solid ways to do this.
Let me take you where the governor was talking a little bit about in the final question. This is great, and I think we're all probably in agreement here, although I'd like Ted to talk about it from the finance side as well. But what do you do about the places and the people who are seriously harmed by that? I mean, a large carbon tax in the United States would put West Virginia and several other states into a real serious challenge. If you think about the last election, 9 of the 9 swing states that Obama won or took to win the election, 7 of those were fracking states, and those 7 states had employment that was above the national average. So in many respects, Obama is the fracking president. So what do you do when you have a tax and you start taking all those jobs out in Colorado and Ohio, the new energy jobs?
Sure. Well, the economic model suggests the biggest effects on the production sectors in coal. And we need to have policies, positive policies, to help coal workers and their communities build a better future. And there are, you know, I'm actually starting a project on this very topic of exactly what can we do with education, early retirement, healthcare, community redevelopment, ecological restoration in coal country can provide a better future for these folks. And frankly, in a lot of ways, coal has never been particularly nice to its workers. So let's find a better future for the folks and have that as a positive agenda while we endeavor to protect the climate as well.
Want to jump in, Ted? Sure. Well, let me start off and thank. It's so good to be here and see friends, make new friends. Some of the conversations that I went to yesterday, the panels, were just first rate. So what a great audience you are. So it's a great pleasure to be here. A carbon tax is an obvious first place to start. And people who disagree with that in terms of economic policy need to go back and rethink again. However, that politically I think is going to be difficult. We have to be very smart about how we get that done. One of the things that I think may make a lot of sense, Massachusetts has got a very aggressive group of people who are convinced they can get a carbon tax started in Massachusetts. And they got smart ideas about how they're going to reinvest that so the economy in Massachusetts starts growing faster than other economies. California is tinkering around with this and putting a price on carbon in ways that I think are going to be good. So that sort of goes back to a point that the governor said, which is let's see more state leadership. But a second point that I want to emphasize, and Jeff, you made it, is as a banker, it's a lot easier to finance something that's going to make money. Financing something that's going to lose money, frankly, is very difficult. And that's where we have all sorts of subsidies. The subsidies, the investment tax credit, the production tax credit, are incredibly expensive, and they haven't moved the needle very much. Let me try to quantify that statement. We've seen the price of solar come down dramatically over the past 8 years. Wind has come down, not as much. So you'd think, gee, since it's come down so much, clearly we can start financing solar and wind. But the fact still remains that the cost of clean energy is generally more expensive than conventional alternative fuels. That's a fact. We've got to acknowledge that. That's why renewable portfolio standards were helpful, why we needed the ITC. But the ITC and production tax credit have a fundamental problem. They don't stimulate innovation. So what we need are state policies and more federal policy that's going to stimulate innovation through research and development that's going to drive down and bring in new technologies in both solar, wind, and other forms of clean energy so that it is actually competitive. And in fact, where you want to be in terms of pure finance, we want the cost of alternative energy to be less than conventional dirty energy. Once it's less, it's a lot easier for you to go ahead and finance it, and you're going to overcome the fact you've got this incredible infrastructure in place, which in many ways you're trying to put in a new infrastructure. So a carbon tax, one of the things that we want to do with it is we need to invest a lot more money in R&D. So where are you going to get that money? Some of it could come from a carbon tax. And I agree completely with what you just said about we have to be very responsive to the people who live in communities that are going to be affected by this. Mr. Blankenship, you know who he is? Well, Mr. Blankenship was not a good person, and he's going to jail where he belongs. But the way he abused the law, the way he abused the political system is scandalous, and that still is a mystery to me why people stood and tolerated for as long as they did. And we have to hold some of these people to be more accountable. And one of the statistics that I find is amazing is the damage that coal does to public health. 2.5 particles. You all know all about that. That's a huge cost. And if we recognize that cost and try to decrease it by putting a tax on dirty energy, we're going to get that money back in lower health care costs. Now, let me go back to what I started to say at the beginning. Where are we in terms of the amount of clean energy? The costs have come down. Gee, we should have made a lot of progress. Well, we've got about 60 gigawatts of solar in place now. And we've got, probably 13 or 14, maybe 15 gigawatts of wind in place now. Gee, that sounds like a lot. It's less than 4.5% of the nation's generating capacity. We have not moved the needle yet, and that's what we have to do. And in my opinion, the best way of going to do that, recognizing the huge capital costs that are required to build this alternative infrastructure and to put it in sort of maternal terms, the gestation period is long. You make these investments, it takes a long time to get it done and to get it financed. And so we need to recognize the very straightforward financial challenges that we have. But this is clearly doable in my opinion, and that's what keeps me so charged up about the job I have. And the exciting part is that every day I see incredible technologies that come across my desk which are in early stages. Many of them we can't finance because they just need $5 million or $6 million. And that's something that we're a large bank and we can't finance something like that. You can't go to the markets. But we try to introduce them to people. And the technologies are just amazing. One of which I'm very excited about. One of, unfortunately, it's a Chinese client, but I don't really care. They've now got a solar panel efficiency of 21%, where they're using more of the light that comes out of the sun and turn more of that light into energy. Well, that's what we need to do. We need more of that. They've done that. There's no reason that American companies can't do that. We see great technologies in turning water out of mines, acid mine drainage, leachate coming out of landfills that can be purified and can be used for agriculture, can even be used for drinking water. Or how about water that would normally be, you can't re-inject in the fracking, but this has to be put in holding ponds. I support fracking. I believe that there are environmental challenges that are associated with it, but I believe they can be managed. And we need to manage them. Therefore, we need the best business practices, which change all the time, and we need smart, sensible regulations. And the leaders in this sector, I believe, recognize that, the leading companies. So let's make sure that we use all of these alternatives to take advantage of it so we can actually pass on to our children an environment that's better than the one we're living in today, as generally has been the case in this country. In our generation, I'm sad to say, we've fallen down. So let's meet this challenge.
Thank you. I want to come back to all of this, the finance, the tax, carbon tax, or other solutions, and what we do at state and local level. But before we do that, I'd like to draw Naoko into this conversation about, from the global standpoint, what are the role of global financial institutions and climate change. 2015 is a very important year for climate change. We're hoping, all of us are hoping that governments will come in the Paris to a universal climate agreement in Paris in December. There's so much there, and I think one of the things about the United States is the United States should really be multiple countries sitting at these negotiations and discussions, because the federal government has, for political and other reasons, has been very reluctant and unable to make the kinds of commitments that states are making and that governors are making. And California alone is, I think, in the top 10 of the world's economies if it were a nation state itself. So from your standpoint, Naoko, first of all, tell us a little bit about what your expectations are from the Paris discussions. Tell us a little bit about where you see from the GEF side where the public funds can most catalyze creative private sector development in certain areas. And I want to, as you do that, I also want to come back to the question of the role of the United States in things like technology exchange. We've made these enormous agreements with China now as the United States and China together to develop and finance certain technologies. How can we be a leader even when our public policy at the federal level may not lead?
Thank you. First and foremost, for organizers, thank you so much for having me at this very exciting panel. And thank you, Jeff, for letting me know about the history of two GEFs. And actually, 3 years ago, I was elected as the position of the CEO of the Global Environment Facility, and I got the Google. I actually searched Google, then the Google got me to your GEF, so which actually tells us that the fact and enormous work you have done in the last 25 years or so. For congratulations for you. Going back to your question of our expectation for Paris, certainly this year, 2015, is such a critical year for the climate and the decision for the climate, and which dictates us not only for our generation but the future generation of the human being, so that we need to really collect all our goodwills and all of the instruments available to us to make sure that at the Paris scope that the quality global agreement for climate be struck. And for that purpose, I think that we need to do maybe two things. The first and foremost, we need to make sure that each of countries that come up with a quality agreement or their contribution to the global agreement, so that then each country should come up with a very good plan to how to transit to low carbon economy. From that point of view, institutions like us, that the public institutions should help them to come up with a good plan, which not only have a good, ambitious mitigation plan, but also coupled with a adaptation and resilience building. Then that issue, that the role of the finance is so important to help them move on to that transition and catalyze needed private sector resources, which Jeff has already passionately discussed and raised as a very important point. Then that I just want to tell a little bit about how I see that then our role, the institution like us, to help that that transition to low carbon economy. I think that then what we are doing is that basically two fronts. One is, as already two previous speakers mentioned, to help the government come up with a suitable policy framework in areas of climate, clean energy. For instance, that how to help countries come up with a good, feed-in tariff. Here, I think we have already helped the government of South Africa or China to introduce the feed-in tariff in the wind, which catalyzed a huge, not only public but the private sector investment in these areas. Then another area is definitely that the one that you mentioned, that how to take the risk of private sector, which cannot really take that huge risk beyond the normal business risk. And this risk comes from maybe two areas. One is that the technology is maybe not known or maybe still expensive. So then here that I see our role in case of, say, the CSP, concentrated solar power. I think that we invested a lot in 15 years ago, which created a very good learning curve, say in Egypt, that Morocco and Mexico, that our investment help the private sector to come in and drive this cost curve enormously. So that's one example that how the public institution can take the risk of, say, technology risk, which the private sector cannot take. But another area is more like how to aggregate that demand, which may be profitable, but very small or not known from capital market. So how we can link up the demand, profitable, potentially profitable demand, however scattered in the scattered unknown, then how we can link up and aggregate and link up with the capital market. Here, one good example which we have recently achieved is that the Sub-Saharan Africa Renewable Energy Equity Fund. Here, that the fund managers actually goes to that to find that to work with developers and to come up with a potentially profitable renewable energy project, that which is not a big one but a small one, but each of them can be potentially profitable. Then that we take the risk of the first loss together with, say, African Development Bank and some of the bilateral government, then link up with institutional investors like a pension fund or the insurance, and which proven to be very, very successful. So there is a way to link up that potentially profitable small-scale clean energy projects to the institutional market. However, this kind of scheme needs a role of the public sector institution to take the risk and also to do the aggregation, so that I'm very hopeful that the financial sector, finance has can have a very significant role to catalyze actions on the ground.
So I'm going to get Ted in here to talk about this, because what I've seen very much, Naoko, is that there are GEF projects and others that stimulate these small-scale projects, and the challenge is to get that private sector in, and particularly in a atmosphere or a regulatory climate where there isn't really a project finance tradition. There aren't laws and regulations that support that. And as Ted started to emphasize before, when you're making public or private investments in, say, large energy facilities, whether they're renewable or coal, you're expecting a 40-year lifetime. You have to amortize your capital expenses over that time. How can you depend on that? Ted, what do you think, as you look as a banker at Barclays, if you look at countries like perhaps Cameroon or other African countries where renewable energy projects could be financed by the private sector, but we need a better climate for doing that?
Well, one of the Naoko, you made a couple of very good points, which I'd like to try to expand on a little bit. One of the projects that we are looking at, and we haven't quite got it to the point where it's working yet, but we're getting close. I may be knocking on your door to say, hey, here's something that should work. We are talking to a number of very small entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan Africa. They've got business models where they think that they can put on a solar panel on one person's house, and it will do a number of things. One, it'll provide just enough electricity to charge a cell phone. That is a huge economic driver because that then gives people that live in that house access to markets. It may replace some kind of a stove that burns either wood or dung. More people die of respiratory diseases in sub-Saharan Africa than the combination of malaria and AIDS. So you get these stoves out of their houses, which are filled with smoke that are horrible on the kids, horrible on the adults, and you're using solar power to provide just enough energy to do that. And if you scale it up a little bit, you can provide them with even a few more watts that would drive a small pump that could take water out of deep wells, and because it's a deep well, it'll be fully enclosed, so it's not an open well into which all sorts of bad things go and people have diarrhea and they die. And just maybe you can do a little bit more on irrigation, not much, and you aggregate these panels together at the village level, and that's where we're running into problems, getting some sort of enough of a model where we actually can go to villages and say, here's how you do it. You got to show by doing. And the other thing which we want to do is use this to power very efficient refrigerators so you can store medicine, and they will have access to medicine that needs to be stored. Now, even if the cost per watt is relatively high, the economic benefits to that village or to that house are so significant that they actually can afford that. It's a little bit like micro-lending, where micro-lending, the cost of a loan generally to women, we would say, my gosh, those are usurious rates. They're paying 15%. But they make 15% because having access to a little bit of money makes it worth their while. The same thing is true. We're still working this out. We haven't quite got the model right yet, and we're working with the entrepreneurs. But that, I think, illustrates exactly the concept that you were making and about which I'm immensely enthusiastic. And if we get that right, that will be financeable.
May I just
Please,
follow
please.
Fatten? He said, actually, the last week I was in Davos, and one of the sessions I attended is how to close the energy gap in Africa. And here, clean energy is the star. I mean, this is the function that which is expected to really close this gap, because that it's going to be so expensive to try to make that on-grid everything. And here, that an off-grid, small-scale, clean energy is economical. It's most economic. While it's true that still there may be some kind of public sector money needs to be put in, because that in order to really close the energy gap, not everything is still 100% economically, profitable. However, this may be the most economic model for us to really work on. And here in US, that USAID's flagship program, Power Africa, and particularly Beyond the Grid initiative can play a big role to, first and foremost, to make the policy right, but also to put the subsidy that to make that model work. And institutions like us also want to join hand to make that model really ongoing.
Sure.
Just step back for a second. What are we talking about in sub-Saharan Africa? We're talking about them leapfrogging from large centralized plants to microgrids. Guess what? That's what we're thinking about doing in this country. They may be able to get ahead of the learning curve of us because the model, exactly as you said, Naoko, is much more relevant to them. It's relevant to us also.
Well, and in fact, we have an investment fund and team in Africa that does both investment in sustainable forestry and in new growth capital for companies. And when I look at it, there already is a microgrid in Africa and actually in many other developing countries such as India, and it's called a backup diesel generator. Because if you go to Nigeria today, the power is always out. There's no electricity. Even the largest energy users, big factories, manufacturers, are using their diesel backups more than they use the grid. And we've started in Nigeria, in this case in Nigeria, to deliver natural gas that's being flared today, so it's very bad for the climate. Gather that in cooperation with Shell, and then bring it on shore, compress it, and deliver it over trucks where there isn't pipeline to Coca-Cola, to Nestle's, to Heineken breweries. And so that's a microgrid. And they'll never go to the grid. They're going to self-generate their own electricity, and they're going to use that for all of their boilers and so on. And at the local level, this is possible increasingly, we see with biomass in Africa. There's a great deal of biomass that's wasted. Even in our forest products companies, they're so inefficient in the way they use a tree. And in the forest industry, like in the United States or Canada, you make your money by the byproducts, not by the beautiful piece of wood that you get out of the bottom of the tree. And the byproducts in Africa are mostly sitting on the ground in these giant piles that are just then generating methane gas. So there's terrific opportunity for the private sector. And I think, Ted, you're right. It starts small because that's where we know it won't fall over in a sense, and the bigger it gets, the more it needs strong government participation and protection and regulation. Naoko, I wanted to just bring you in on the issue of the Green Climate Fund and some of the steps you think of, the things we've been talking about, some of the things the significance of that.
I think that the strong Green Climate Fund is a very important signal. It's more like a symbolic signal to the negotiation towards 2015 Paris. And actually that the US-China agreement, that announcement came along the same time as that recapitalization of the Green Climate Fund. So I think this kind of policy signal, it's such an important factor to bring that the 2015 agreement be actually successful. And the world needs financial resources to make that transition as smooth as possible. So that I congratulate that the recapitalization of the Green Climate Fund, and also the initiative leadership led by actually the US government.
Well, that's a good segue, Naoko. I don't want to put you on the spot, but what do you see in terms of the U.S. leadership needed to achieve some of the objectives at the global level? Without the United States, as we saw with Kyoto, it means a lot of rhetoric, but it doesn't mean a lot of results. And so how do we get the United States to be a major participant in the next regime of climate change discussions?
We all know that without US and without China, we cannot really make a big dent. So from that point of view, I just want to repeat that the US-China agreement already make a big dent. And what we understand is that an agreement can be achieved without congressional action, which actually give us a lot of hope that then which become a real. So that from our point of view, that the U.S. and China, if these two countries continue to achieve or implement what they have promised, that has been already a very significant step. And for Green Climate Fund to fit, by now the US is the top donor. Again, that they should make sure that the Green Climate Fund actually deliver what they are promising.
I don't want to overstate, but the agreement that was reached between the United States and China is hugely important, partly because China had opposed a lot of the initiatives that we were trying to accomplish at the global level. And China was saying, we represent, in effect, the developing world, and you're putting an undue burden on the developing world. So this agreement represents a seismic shift in China's leadership role globally, I believe. And also we are seeing the Chinese domestically do some very interesting things, which I can go into if people want offline. I don't yet know what the results of the conversations were between the President and Prime Minister Modi, but they clearly talked about this. And Naoko, you may have some insight into that. Nobody I've talked to yet can tell me what actually was said or what was agreed. But if India were to join in some way the agreement between China and the United States, maybe not directly but indirectly, that would change the negotiating posture of the COP in Paris later this year. Now, that doesn't mean I'm wildly optimistic, but I'm saying that we're beginning to lay some very important groundwork, and just possibly we might be able to get the outlines of an agreement such that governments, either by saying these are things that we want to do, clearly getting Congress to do something is essential. Now there, I'm totally in the agreement with the Governor Granholm. Congress, yes, is worse than cockroaches. I love that analogy. And we have to hold Congress accountable.
Adele.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this, the U.S. side of this agreement, because I think it's really important to understand what's baked into the promise the U.S. has made. So yes, indeed, the administration's put forward an emissions objective that doesn't depend on Congress, but it does depend on full deployment of the existing regulatory authority under the Clean Air Act. And I just have to say, my first job out of grad school was at the Office of Management and Budget, and my job was to oversee regulations for the White House. And it was it's not even in my bio, but anyway, it was a scarring experience because it was a front row seat into the real regulatory process in all its warts, the fits, the starts, the litigation, the non-compliance, the further litigation. And I just want to caution everybody, absolutely, I think regulating under the Clean Air Act, as EPA has proposed to do for stationary sources, starting with new and existing power plants, is absolutely the right thing to do if we don't have an alternative. But let us be mindful of the sort of probability distribution around which those regulatory outcomes are going to play out. And so while I support the U.S. ambition, that goal is dependent on a lot of ducks lining up between now and 2030, including having future administrations that follow through on a very ambitious regulatory agenda and a fairly rosy scenario for how all that litigation and compliance goes forward. So I would say to folks who are most concerned about the climate, please don't give up on this search for an alternative authority that's going to provide clear, direct market signals sooner rather than later, and think you're going to rely instead on a protracted and messy regulatory process.
Well, Adele, let me build on that, because we're right in the middle of this in terms of the public finance issues and private finance issues. In 2012, we had record numbers of coal-fired power plants taken offline, and we had record numbers of new or existing natural gas plants fired up quite a bit. And everybody was euphoric. The United States has gone beyond even what they would have committed to in Kyoto and so on. But it was purely a matter of arbitrage of cost for the utilities. Those power plants, many of the utilities have just mothballed them, have held them, they're not firing them up right now, but they still have economic life. And the price of natural gas is now twice as much as it was in 2012 here in the United States. So you see that the percentage of coal versus natural gas has actually gone back the other way in the for 2013 and 2014. So without strong regulation to back that, the private sector moved. They took a lot of coal-fired power plants offline when natural gas went lower. But you need regulatory challenge. Just a simple piece of that regulation is, and if the coal plant's taken offline, it's got to meet new plant standards to come back on. Would certainly change that permanently rather than leaving it just to the private sector to switch one way or the other way depending upon energy prices.
Yeah, and so we've seen kind of the underlying challenges certainly in the electricity sector, but I should also point out EPA's proposed rule is only for the electricity sector, and there will be separate rulemakings for other stationary source categories. It's going to be oil refineries, chemical plants, cement plants, pulp and paper, etc. This is a long process. And even, my good friends at EPA who work long hours are going to have a tough time going through that kind of ambitious agenda in time for us to really avoid a very serious risk to the climate. So I would just say, again, that we need to have that conversation of pricing carbon at all different levels. Internationally, I think comparing carbon prices as a measure of effort is certainly extremely important component of that. Nationally, as I've discussed, state level, we haven't talked yet about pricing carbon at the state level, but states could easily comply with these EPA regulations by adopting a carbon tax now, and I'm encouraging EPA to write its rules in a way that would be consistent with that. And corporations, in my view, should be thinking now how to price carbon into their investment strategies and preparing for a carbon-constrained future where their capital stock is not going to be stranded economically because they didn't plan ahead. So at all these different levels, we have to be thinking about weaving the cost of carbon into our economy.
So we have some really interesting questions, and actually they cohere around our conversation. It seems to me that something Governor Grantham was alluding to is that what's happening in the United States is this bubbling up of state action, and in the private sector actions are being taken and they're becoming part of the norm. And even if we have petroleum prices falling and anti-regulatory issues at the federal level, many of these initiatives aren't going to go away. And because I work all over the world, I can tell you, in my opinion, the same thing is happening in China. For example, I mean, they have to commission a coal-fired power plant a week practically, but they're also commissioning more renewable energy than anybody right now. But we've talked about India. We have a company in India that's been built up in the last few years that has 1,000 megawatts of all renewable, all green power. We've actually invested in 2 of them. Another one will have 1,000 megawatts soon. So quietly behind the scenes, India cannot deliver its own coal. The coal industry is so screwed up. It cannot get its natural gas in the pipeline to deliver in the power sector. The only new power that's coming online is small and medium scale renewable power in India. And then decentralized grids and new electricity efficiency technologies in India are springing up because last year 560 million people lost electricity all at once. So I think there are some positive things in the private sector in all the big 3 countries, and eventually that will pressure at the national level in all 3 countries, but none of them, seems to me, the leadership is quite ready to jump out and take the full lead. But it is, to me, again, it comes back to what we thought in 1990 when we could solve these problems overnight and then realized it's going to be slow and steady. And we're making slow and steady progress. It's not satisfactory for us all. We have a bunch of questions both on the international and the U.S. level. So let me start with the U.S. level. Several questions effectively said, can you take a carbon tax and put the capital that you collect from that into subsidies for new energy or new anti-greenhouse gas emissions programs? And Adele, I'm going to start with you. But Ted, I also want to say we need to, from the private sector side, be a little skeptical about how whether governments with their thumbs can do that kind of a maneuver.
So the purpose of the carbon tax is to change the relative prices of different sources of energy and emitting activities, and simply to make those more costly relative to alternative economic decisions. So once you've corrected that failure of the market to not price the emissions and environmental damages, you don't need to use that carbon tax revenue to further correct the market. You've already fixed that. Now, you still need to do basic research and a lot of the other things that remaining market failures, but it doesn't really make sense to use carbon tax revenue to subsidize renewables because you just tax their competitors, and all you're going to do is fund people to do stuff they were going to do anyway, or you're going to be paying them to do stuff that wasn't cost effective at the tax you just set. If you don't like your tax, raise it, but don't use that revenue to compensate people where you just induce them to do, okay? So what you want to do with that revenue is two main things. One, reduce the macroeconomic burden of that new tax. And believe me, it's a new tax. It comes with a burden. And you can do that by lowering other tax burdens, reducing the federal debt, which means reducing future tax burdens and the burden of carrying that debt going forward. You can do other pro-growth spending. If you believe Larry Summers, that means infrastructure. And you can return that money to low-income households and make sure they're not worse off. But I would be careful both economically and politically about earmarking such a large amount of money. We're talking about $100 billion a year or more in revenue for what many Republicans are going to view as kind of sketchy green spending. I think there are more pro-growth, more economically efficient things to do with the money. Certainly ways to benefit the lower income households that are probably higher priorities than inducing more abatement where you've already got the price signal fixed.
I agree. I'd have to really listen hard to find something that you just said that I disagree with. I couldn't find it. And I think there's a group that is trying to pass a carbon tax at the national level, and they're trying to reach out to the Republicans and get them on board. And their idea is that we'll have a carbon tax and it'll be redistributed back to the American public in the form of a dividend, so everybody gets it back. Well, that has a certain amount of simplicity and logic to it, but it does nothing for the future. So this group was all Democrats, and they came in and met with me, and despite my language today, I actually am a Republican, but I'm a moderate Republican.
That's an oxymoron, isn't it?
Well, we're an endangered species, at least. And I said, I find it odd that I'm the only Republican in this room, and I'm suggesting that a dividend back to the people is the wrong way to invest the money. We should be thinking about how do you use this to do exactly what the governor was talking about. How do we create jobs? How do we invest it in infrastructure? How do we invest it in R&D? And how do we help use some of the money to accelerate the kinds of changes in education if we complete the race to the top, which I think was fairly effective, so that we can create great jobs for people who have not necessarily had benefited from a college education, because I believe firmly we do not want to have American blue-collar workers competing with Chinese blue-collar workers. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a sucker's game, and we will lose. And then they will move those, China will move those blue-collar jobs to Cambodia and Laos. That's not where we want Americans to be. We want to be creating jobs that are both capital intensive and technology intensive, so people can actually make enough money to have a decent life, and they're not working flipping hamburgers all the time, trying to live from one week to another. That's not the economic future that I would envisage for this country.
It's really nice to have bipartisan agreement, but we're not in Washington, D.C. We're across the river, so we can try for that. I will just say to all of you who submitted questions, the two answers we just got sort of rushed across about 6 of the cards that I have here, so I hope if I didn't read your exact question, you heard part of your answer here. Because I do want to take the last couple of minutes to globalize this with and involve Naoko in the conversation as well. First of all, in the context of the United States and whether or not we have a carbon tax, Is there a need, and I sort of alluded to it in my export coal story at the beginning, is there a need for convergence here? If we take the action, but India and China don't have similar regimes for taxing carbon or otherwise, are we going to be leaking jobs, losing jobs, where does it all play out in terms of your thoughts about an international agreement and the necessity of particularly the big three countries that we've mentioned, India, China, and the United States, to come to some kind of a larger agreement?
Wonderful international political question, which I hope that I can address to some extent. I understand the significance of this U.S.-China agreement is to actually come up with a real parity line for both of the president and the leadership could agree that this is good enough for me, President Obama, or Chinese leadership to really come together to announce to the globe. So that my understanding of that significance is this is really, really the best they could do proudly, but it's equally that if I were the U.S. side, we were sure that China, this is the best they can deliver. From Chinese side, the same thing. This is the best maybe U.S. can deliver. So that kind of discussion, in my understanding, really bring this the quality of that agreement really to the maximum. So in my view, that this agreement has such a significant impact and the mileage to the negotiation, or to the global negotiation. Maybe same thing we could say for India. I understand this, and the U.S.-China, the agreement has quite a pressure, but the pressure for India side. So for the India, though that distance, but third, a GHG emission country can do to deliver that will contribute to the global agreement. So that there are a lot of interesting components in that kind of agreement, or that the fact that India could deliver. One component which I was really interested in is this, how to support this Prime Minister Modi's agreement, or the promise of 100 gigawatt clean energy. If we could help him to mobilize, that this will have a huge impact for the global agreement. And I think our duty is to make sure that we can provide the best framework, the instrument, so that India could deliver that kind of promise.
So I want to thank our panelists, and I just wanted to conclude on one thought that relates to government creating jobs around clean energy and so on. I argued quite vociferously early in the Obama administration, with nobody listening at all, that they should not worry about the solar panel and China undercutting U.S. jobs in manufacturing, because the fall of the price of the solar panel was terrific opportunity. And whether it was Chinese or American, we can't close our borders. But we wanted the subsidies to go away. We wanted the price to fall, because if you make solar energy ubiquitous, and this is what I argued with my governor in Maryland at the beginning of his administration, give every consumer, as part of the stimulus plan, give every household a rebate if they put solar panels on their roof, because that solar panel, even if it's manufactured in China, is going to have 2 or 3 or 4 workers on your roof installing it. You're going to have electricians and plumbers if you do a solar thermal part to it, and it's going to be up there for 25 or 30 years, and it's going to generate electrons for that amount of time. If you think about the value added through the total life cycle of that solar panel, the value added of the manufacturing jobs in China is relatively small. So in the United States, my point is that's not threatening, as Ted said. It's not threatening that China or Laos or somewhere or India can manufacture a solar panel cheaper than we can. Let's get them out there, and then the economic value of them is enormous for us, and we employ people locally in our states. Governors can think about that for renewable. That's the advantage of microgrids, renewable energy, distributed generation, all the things we've been talking about today. So we're hoping that at the local, the state, the national and the global level, that we can continue to convince governments to play a positive role in the markets, but at least I think we're all in a somewhat of agreement that the subsidies themselves, taking away the subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, the answer is not necessarily to pour them into the clean energy industry. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Find the workshop organizers and note takers for this afternoon that at lunch after the coming symposia you are gathering in the Chesapeake View Room, which is at the very, very top of the hotel. So long as you're not standing on the roof, you can't go any higher. Okay? Thank you so much. Wonderful session. And I would just say there is a session on solar energy, the terawatt challenge coming up right now. So that may be of interest on that last note. Thank you so much.